and welcome to this episode of Battling with Business with me, Gareth Tennant.
And me, Chris Kitchener.
In this podcast, we explore ideas and concepts around teams and teamwork, leaders and leadership, and all things in between. It's a discussion between a former Royal Marines officer and a product manager from the world of business, comparing and contrasting our experiences as we attempt to work out what makes teams, leaders, and businesses tick. And this week, we're on another of our influencers episodes. And in the past, we have tried to sell this idea that the influencer we're doing is a bit of a surprise to the audience. And we've talked through who it might be, completely undermined by the fact that you already know, of course, because the title of the podcast has the person's name in it. But this week, we are genuinely doing it as a surprise because Chris, you are the lead for this. You've done all the research on whoever it is we're doing, and I have absolutely no idea who they are.
And just to be clear, that's not because Gareth is being lazy and hasn't bothered to ask.
I am lazy.
Well, that may or may not be true, but it's explicitly because as I learned about this person who I had not come across before, I thought it might be interesting and fun, literally, to see if Gareth did or didn't know this person. And my suspicion is you might not know this person because they are, I would argue, one of history's hidden influencers, but we'll come on to that. So the person we're doing today, I love this because normally, as you say, everyone knows who this is, but you're the one person who doesn't.
Yeah.
Today, this is a story of an influencer with individual brilliance. I was reading the work of this person just yesterday, and you can tell this person is extraordinarily clever and insightful. So it's a story of individual brilliance. That's true. But this person also developed a wide range of ideas that, frankly, we take for granted today. And as you've heard me sort of say, arguably, I think the source has been forgotten. This person turned what was existing views upside down, and I think was probably at the time considered either a heretic or a lunatic, or probably more likely both. This person also never ran a business. By the way, this is like the game where you flip people down. Do they have a beard? Do they have a... You won't get it from any of this, but this is more sort of context. This person never ran a business. And really oddly for influencers, apart from who this person is, it's not clear that we're necessarily going to learn anything new today. I don't know that I'm going to give you any concepts that you haven't heard today.
I've got an idea who it might be.
But, well, I'll ask you in a minute. I will ask you. But I think we're going to learn today why we think about management and leadership in some of the ways that we do. In fact, some of the ways that we consider just obvious. And I can't believe anyone ever had to almost think about this. This person wasn't in the military. I'm looking at Gareth's eyes to see if hang on, he's nodding in a way that says he knows who this will.
No, I don't. Out. Who I thought it was, you've just said something that makes me now think it's not.
Okay, and if this person had sat with the military strategist of the time, I suspect she might have been dismissed by them. I'm giving you few clues here. This person disrupted the way people thought about leadership and management at the time, promoting human relations and emotional intelligence, advocating democratic leadership and participative decision-making, viewing organizations as organic systems rather than rigid machines, and espoused what some people would argue are the original ideas around transformational leadership. Now, I'm doing this all slowly and dramatically. I think those four things that I talked about, you would all look and go, well, these are all blindingly obvious. We've talked about them lots. This is kind of where some of these ideas were articulated for the first time. The person themselves was also able to talk about what they ultimately achieved while they were talking about leaders. And so there's a number of quotes, and I absolutely love this as a quote from this person. The most successful leader of all is the one who sees another picture not yet actualized. He sees the things that are not yet there. He sees farther than his followers and sees more than the whole situation than his followers do. This will all make a lot more sense later, but that's an incredibly insightful statement about a really nuanced element of leadership that you can see more than everyone else can see. And there's a vision you have, but fascinating that this person said this given what they then did. So we'll learn where many of these ideas came from, celebrate some old favorites. Okay, Gareth, I don't know that I've given you an awful lot. Do you have any idea who this person might be?
I have absolutely no idea. So I know it's a female.
It's a female.
It's a historical person. And from the way you've been talking,
I'll give you a bit more.
I don't think she's alive still.
Late 1800s.
Late 1800s. Was never a business manager.
No,
wasn't
never
in the
ran a business.
military. Late 1800s. Is it Florence Nightingale?
It's not Florence Nightingale. So the answer is a lady by the name of Mary Parker Follett.
I have never heard of Mary Parker Follett.
And I haven't actually written this down in my notes, but we absolutely have to talk about why we don't know who Mary Parker Follett is, because by the end of this, I'm pretty sure you'll be saying, oh, wow. Anyway, Mary Parker Follett, she lived from 1868 to 1933. So a really interesting time in history. And I think sort of post-industrial revolution to the modern age.
Yep.
But it's at that sort of point between the two. And just to sort of get you going about Mary Parker Follett before we get into her early life is she talked about management and she had a definition of management. And Gareth, you've had some fantastic definitions, which I've really enjoyed, to break things into their simplest way. She said management is the art of getting things done through people, which actually I think is probably very similar to what you've used before, but super simple, super straightforward.
So interestingly, that is closer to my definition of leadership, because I would say management is the allocation and balancing of resources to get things done, which includes people's time. But I think once you start talking about motivating people, I think we're into what I would define as leadership.
Interestingly, this is defined as, whenever you look at her in the literature and you look at her documents and people talk about what she did, it's referred to as her management theories.
Yeah.
Interestingly, I don't know at that time, did people make that kind of distinction between management and leadership? And particularly as a woman, would a woman have been allowed to have views on leadership?
That's really interesting. Yeah, I don't know.
Because you are right. As we go through this, you're going to be like, well, that's not management, that's leadership.
Yeah.
I think the point is many of these things are interchangeable. And I would argue, before we get there even, her discussion about management is exactly that. It is about leadership and management in the way that she thinks about particularly people. And maybe that's an interesting thing, that is, management potentially reflects more about systems and processes, and leadership is about the people and how they interact. And so that's it.
Processes. Yeah, I agree.
You'll be pleased to know I'm not going to do my usual 30 minutes of history, naming each university she went to and the qualification, because actually really what I wanted to get onto very much was her theories. But going back to give you some context, she was born in 1868 in Massachusetts in the US. Her father, Charles, was a machinist in a local shoe factory. And what I've found doesn't specifically say it, but I think her mum stayed at home and looked after the family.
Yeah.
However, her mother was in very poor health. There's reference to the fact that she was disabled. And her father died when she was very young. And so in her teenage years, she actually became the head of the household.
She's the oldest sibling.
So I think she's the oldest. And actually, I can't remember whether she had siblings or not, but it's that we do really see this on a regular basis with our influences, that there are these things at an early age that form people and shape them. She herself was obviously going to have to become a leader and a manager, even at that early age.
Yeah.
The family, I don't think, was poor, and so she attended the local private school. So there was an element of juggling, looking after the family, but also going to school. And clearly education was prized specifically by her, but potentially the family as well. But even though she went to school, she spent much of her time caring for her mother. She leaves school, and at 22, she goes to Radcliffe University And she studies there on what's described as an irregular basis until graduating in 1898. And she graduated summa cum laude. And I keep hearing that phrase, and I thought, what does that mean? Do you know what summa cum laude means?
I don't.
This is our Latin corner for the day with highest praise. What it really means is she's in the top 1% to 5%. So she's a smart cookie.
So it's like graduating with honours, but even better.
Correct. Yeah. That's the sort of the highest level people can represent in terms of you passing out.
Cool.
At Radcliffe, she studied government, economics, law, and philosophy. There wasn't a lot described, and it's really interesting thinking about Mary here, in that people don't seem to know an awful lot about her. And I don't think that's because it was secret or it was hidden. I get the feeling nobody could be bothered to ask. So the question is, at the time she studied these things, I don't know how common it was for women to study these things. Again,
so what were they? Law, government, economics?
It was government, economics, law, and philosophy.
Philosophy. That strikes me as a very...
Classical education?
Well, it's a very specific group of subjects that if you are a person who is striving to have a career as a career politician, for example, that seems like the 1880s version of going to Oxford and doing politics, because you're going to be a SPAD and then you're going to be an MP and then you're going to be a minister and then you're going to be prime minister. For a woman to do that in that age is really interesting.
Well, we've talked about Amelia Earhart and how women were treated. I don't have the detail, but to your point, this seems unusual. Whether there were many women and she was one of them, or whether there were very few, I don't know. But anyway, she went and did this in the context of having to look after her family. Her thesis at Radcliffe was the Speaker of the House of Representatives. She published a relatively small amount of work. She published that in 1896. And she then went on to Harvard and was accepted. So clearly, this is a talented person, and that talent was recognized. And in terms of her thesis, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, it's interesting just to touch on this, because I think it gives you a little bit of a glimpse of what she's interested in, or at least the way she thinks. It's often regarded as the first scholarly analysis of the US House of Representatives speakership from a political science and constitutional perspective. And it laid the foundation for her later work. She's looking and saying, that's interesting. There's the House of Representatives. There's a speaker. How does that work?
Yeah.
What are their roles and responsibilities? And she explored the evolution of the speakership, which I didn't know, from its original role as a very neutral presiding officer. It was not a political role, into what is now, and we only have to look at the US politics today, an incredibly powerful political leader with significant influence over the civil legislature.
Yes, and I think if you compare that to the UK's Speaker of the House in the House of Commons, then they are, whilst they are an MP who has been elected and normally representing a party, I don't think we've ever had an independent speaker. Whilst they're in that role, they don't vote, I don't think.
No, I don't think they do.
And they are supposed to be neutral. And I didn't study politics at, either at college or university. But I think my understanding is that the US system was a sort of bastardization of the British system with French influences.
I was going to say, I'm sure the Americans would say not a bastardization, but a beautiful and elegant reimagining.
Reimagining.
But you are right.
Because, of course, the US, prior to being an independent nation, was a colony of Great Britain, and therefore inherited a lot of our political system. But because of the War of Independence, supported heavily by the French, there was a lot of French influence in how they set up the new nation. So I think my interpretation is, and this is probably a slightly wrong, but is that the US system was a French interpretation of the British system. And that's why it starts off, even at its very beginning, looking quite similar but feeling quite different.
I love the idea of an amalgam of the French and English. Anyway, so she does this work, and in fact, what we're going to talk about, she doesn't talk about politics very much more, certainly in the stuff we'll talk about. But this idea of how does something work and how do you break it apart and how do you analyze it is very interesting. And I think as we start to think about some of the theories that she evolved, rather than inventing new theories, it feels to me, and this might be my own bias, it's more a story of observation and abstraction, taking the obvious, making connections, and describing it in a novel way, turning something into principles that we recognize and even today we use. Now, that you can argue semantically and say those are new ideas, but there's lots of observation here, and we'll talk about that in a second. Now, as I was going through this, the research that I did, you're taken very quickly to sort of the high-level summary of her management theories and ideas. And that's satisfying, and we'll talk about that later. But something that struck me as an interesting question, which I didn't really understand, which was, what was management and leadership like in the late 1800s? Because we have this very odd view of, if you said today, what do people think about leadership and management? We have a particular view, very, very, very different in the late 1800s, because it's come from a different place and all sorts of different influences. The first thing is the dominant approach to management and leadership in the late 1800s was influenced by classical management theory. And what I mean by that was, and this is something you've touched on in various episodes, an emphasis on hierarchy, control, and efficiency. And effectively, you can describe it as authoritarian, top-down, mechanistic. And there's some concepts that go with it. Rigid hierarchy with strict chains of command. Traditionally autocratic, directive, top-down leadership style. This is what you're going to do.
Yeah.
Just go and do it. You don't need to think about it. In fact, there was again, it's not in my notes, but there's a reference to the fact that at the time, you don't let the workers think because they're sentimental.
Yeah.
And sentimentality is bad.
So there is a management theorist who is far better known than Mary Parker Follett, called Frederick Winslow Taylor, who may or may not be in your notes, I don't know, because he is seen as the father of the idea of scientific management. So this is, as you've said, this is an age of sort of the post-industrialization. We've gone through the Reformation, scientific method. This has culminated in the industry, the mechanization, harnessing the power of coal and steam to be able to do incredible things. And now we're just starting to understand the power of electricity. And Frederick Winslow Taylor codifies this in what he calls the theory of scientific management, which is this idea that, like a machine, you standardize your workers. So he went to the lengths of measuring how far a worker should stand from the production line, and then marking out on the floor, painting lines on the floor and saying, you stand in this box. This is where you are optimally positioned to do your job. He measured people's arm lengths, and if they were not within the normal part of the bell curve, then you weren't allowed to work on that production line because you would be inefficient. And he was driven by this idea of science and using the scientific method to be more and more efficient. And now, what we know, and we've talked about many times before, is that efficiency is sometimes very useful and sometimes isn't.
Exactly. And I think you've described it very well. I mean, I was going to go on to say other things that people thought about was exactly what you said: a focus on efficiency, control, and productivity.
Yeah.
Obedient, task-focused, and low autonomy workers, you stand in that box, you do that. Decision-making centralized at the top, and workers seen as tools or costs. And I agree with you. What I don't want to suggest is that somehow you throw all of that away. Exactly as you say, there is a time for efficiency. But I wonder whether, and we'll get onto this again, is we're starting to think about creativity.
Yeah.
Things that require more than just press the button 100 times.
And I think we have to also recognise it's easy to sort of look at Taylor and sort of castigate these ideas. This is an age where most production is done by people on production lines, and mostly men, but women as well, on production lines, which is work that is now largely done by machines. And so if you can get people to be standardized, work in the same way, then
the benefits.
Things coming off the production line are going to be, closer to being the same, precise, efficient. So there is a logic to that. I think in an age where the dull, dirty, dangerous jobs can be done by robots and machines, then that's less important.
Yeah. So there are more people who'd been developing some of these ideas. In fact, I didn't write down
Frederick Winslow Taylor.
Thank you. I think he was on the list, though. But some people that are worth talking about. Adam Smith in the late 1700s, who talked about the division of labor and efficiency and how the division of labor improved productivity.
Yes.
Charles Babbage of the Babbage engine in the 1800s, efficiency in factory management, and he advocated for the scientific study of operations to improve efficiency. Robert Owens in the 1800s, humanitarian industrial management. Interesting, humanitarian factory efficiency with better work conditions. You can almost see this transition from it's an engine, we need an efficient engine, to it turns out describing management and the workers as an engine may not be sufficient, and there may be more.
Well, it's an interesting use of the word humanitarian, isn't it? But I suppose the logic there is if you are driven by the efficiency of the output, then the quality of the input is important. And part of that is workers that are healthy, motivated, sober, turn up on time, understand their role. And now we're back to the link. Certainly in the UK, here in Britain, we had lots of industrialists who were also philanthropists and religious, very pious religious people. So you've got the likes of the Cadbury brothers, famous for chocolate, who built an entire village, Bourneville, next to their factory
so
that their workers could live and be efficient. But they also imposed things like Bourneville wasn't allowed, as a conurbation, they weren't allowed to sell alcohol. There are more churches, and I think this is probably still true to this day. If you go to Birmingham, there are more churches per number of houses in Bourneville than there are in any other part of Birmingham, because it was mandated by the Cadbury brothers, because they wanted their workers to be sober, they wanted their workers to be disciplined, and they used religion as part of the process of doing that. So I think there is something in this idea of efficiency that starts to be the birth of modern human resource management.
I think you're right. And people who have listened to more than one episode will know our value-based biases. And, there's a small number of things that get me really agitated. And that is when people mistake doing things because they are right for doing things because they're efficient. What I mean by that is I'm almost certain back at the time when the Cadbury brothers are starting to do this, I would imagine the vast majority of other leaders in the world would have said it's wokeness gone mad. Just crack the whip and get it going. That's what these people need. And the point was they are not doing it just because it is the right thing to do. They're doing it is because it is the smart and effective thing to do. To your point, someone who's not drunk who comes into the factory is not going to let their arm get caught up in the machinery. Arms caught in machinery slow down production and cost you money when you have to pay off the person. So I love this idea that even back then there was this struggle between we don't care about the people because that's, I'm going to use our modern language, wokeness, and another person saying, no, I'd quite like to be woke because I'm going to get more out of my people than you. Anyway, let's move on. I wanted to set the context for her ideas because I think that reflects how radical her ideas were and how almost you can draw this line between the old way of management thinking and the new one. So the thing that really connects all of those ideas that I've just talked about is the idea is that the system is the magic, not the people in the system. And until then, it was all about optimizing the engine in terms of developing this organic system with the people inside. Now, Mary Parker Follett thought about things differently based on observation, and we'll talk about sort of a little bit about what she did there. But I think, and it's not called out, but I think there's a massive dollop of empathy as well. What I love about this is I could imagine she'd be a brilliant product manager because she's curious. She wants to know about things. She watches things, wants to understand them, and to a significant degree cares about those things as well. So she was unique amongst her contemporaries. You've all already sort of worked this out, where she integrated psychology, sociology, and management, which isn't, from what we just said, people have done before. She anticipated participative management, transformational leadership, and conflict resolution decades before they were formally theorized, and frankly, almost using words that we take for granted today, but until 20 years ago, no one knew. At the end, I'll talk about this, which is, in fact, I'll do it now because otherwise I'll forget. I went on to Google and ChatGPT and said, who developed transformational leadership? And they said, it's a chap in 1973. And I'm thinking, is it? I'm not convinced. Now I've seen what's going on here. Very interesting. Anyway, let's talk about some of her concepts. And so, Mary, I apologize. This is now going to be perhaps less about you and more about these concepts. So she worked for 8 years as a social worker. There's your observation and empathy. She's seeing people. She's seeing how they behave. And for want of a better word, how you get better outcomes from people.
So it's interesting that somebody who's clearly very academically capable, who studied law, economics, government, and philosophy, goes on to be a social worker. And I wonder if that is because, as a woman at the time, even though she was hugely academically qualified to go into the field of management, she was society railroaded her into.
True. And almost it's a lucky accident because super smart, the academic background, the empathy, you have to have empathy to be able to go into these things before you dismiss them, and the interest and the ability to go into it. There's a magic cake there. There's, hang on a minute, I can connect these two things.
There's an interesting, it's a counterfactual, we'll never be able to prove it, but if society had allowed her as a woman to go into industry as a manager or politics as a leader, would she have come up with these theories, or was it the fact that there were these barriers to entry, these glass ceilings that forced her to go down a different route, which gave her different experiences? Is it a happy accident? It's interesting.
Yeah, I don't know. And I know what you're going to say at the end of this. You're going to say, I want to go and read this, and I've actually got one of her documents. I think this gave her the ability to see the world through a different lens. In her work that she has done, she is rich with simple examples that prove the point. And these simple examples often come from people she meets and talks to. And so I'm more inclined on the sort of the scale of, would she have done this anyway? Was this a happy coincidence? I'm probably a little bit more on the happy coincidence, but it doesn't matter. The magic was putting the things together.
Yeah.
I would imagine there were other social workers who were like, oh, being nice to people, isn't that great? And she was like, hang on a minute, I can see what's going on. Anyway, as she did this, she did a lot of work around community spaces.
I think you've just undermined the entire profession of social work there, but okay.
So thanks for pointing that out, as I realise that's the case. But the key thing was making those connections.
Yes.
She also developed vocational guidance and evening programs in public school. So again, this is not just a theoreticist. This is a person who puts their beliefs and theories into practice. And group dynamics, how groups work together, I think underpins a huge amount of what she does, and we'll talk about specifics. The next idea is this idea that I've used, which is, I hate because it's difficult to say, participatory democracy. She was involved in local recreational, educational, and advocacy groups, which helped her develop these ideas of democracy and people participating in democracy. In short, her view was People affect and change other people through their interactions and the society around them. She quote, thus the self and the society are in a cycle in which they constantly help to create one another. Hang on a minute, you're crazy. It's a machine. You put the coin in the front, you turn the handle and the thing comes out at the end. And she's saying, no, that's not how it works. I go into work and I'm in a bad mood. I have an impact on other people.
Yeah.
I don't like you. You treat me poorly. You treat me well. All of these things actually come together and they have an impact. So she realized that the model of these old organizations, as we've talked about, how they're run, led, and managed may not have been the most efficient. And so she talked about, and as we're going through, please, whether you're listening on the podcast or it's Gareth and you go, well, that's blindingly obvious. Yes, it's blindingly obvious now, but at the time it wasn't. It was radical. I think radical is the right word. She pioneered the theory of what she described as lateral processes within hierarchical organizations. And you think, well, that sounds complicated. You're going to find out it's not even slightly complicated. It says, rather than the old days where you had to go up to the leader, ask them for something, and then the leader went back down the organization and found someone and said, you need to do a thing. The thing was done, and then you go back up to the leader and come back. You should go talk to the person and ask them to go do that thing for you. In other words, go to the people you need to talk to get the thing you need done. And the effectiveness is not by a vertical hierarchy, by a horizontal, go talk to the people you need to.
Yeah.
And I know I can see the hamster running around your head, Gareth, and cross-functional, matrixed, all these kind of things. You're absolutely right. So she talked about some very specific concepts. Direct contact. People at the same organizational level communicate directly with each other to solve problems without needing managerial mediation. I can't imagine anyone today that wouldn't imagine that's how you do things. But remember what we've just said. We've just come from a world where actually, with some exceptions, that is absolutely not how people said you should do things.
Well, I mean, it's interesting that as you were talking about that, I was thinking there's all these modern ideas of matrix management, cross-functional teams, and Jeff Bezos famously sending his thing about APIs. Everybody must be sharing data, and loads of contemporary thought on this subject. But fundamentally, if you don't have a hierarchy and you allow people to just talk to each other at the same level, then you reduce the power and the influence of the people above them. And therefore, whilst we know that this is a sensible way of creating better teams with better outputs, there is a natural inclination for managers, for bosses, to stop this happening, to try and regain control, because information is power and people are human. And so, yes, today we have all of these contemporary theories and ideas, and we do, to some extent, put them into practice. There is still an awful lot of stovepiping of information and what I would consider bad management practice of shutting down cross-functional teams simply so that you can retain your importance.
It turns out there are no new problems in the world. There are just different names for them.
Yes.
To think that over 100 years ago, she was saying, hey, everyone, there's a different way of doing it. I think it's very interesting.
Yeah.
Let's take a quick break, because I know we're sort of just over half an hour in. And when we come back, I want to talk about some more of her concepts, because I think we're starting to build not just this idea of she has one good idea, she actually has this whole set of interlinking ideas, which is designed to create this, I'm going to use the word organic system rather than a mechanistic system. Yeah. So we'll come back straight after this. Welcome back. Just before the break, we started talking about some of Mary's big ideas. And I love the fact that they're so blindingly obvious. We cheat. I'll tell you what happened. We stopped to grab a cup of coffee. And as we were talking about this, we were discussing why we thought we didn't know more about Mary. And Gareth was saying, well, actually, I've done quite a lot of research around this. I've not come across her name before. And here was our conclusion. The first thing was that I think at the time, I have to believe this was considered radical.
Yeah.
I have to believe this really was heresy, that you don't understand, keep the workers down, crack the whip, and away we go. The second thing, unfortunately, but I have to assume there's an element of this, is sexism, that she was a woman and what could a woman know? And then more recently, I wonder whether then sort of the icing on the cake for why we don't know more about her is, well, it's not really that interesting because it's all blindingly obvious. And as we've discussed at great length, at the time, it was not blindingly obvious. And we have people, as it were, rediscovering some of her ideas in the 70s and 80s and even now.
Yeah.
So fascinating that she's been lost to time, but she's so important. I did suggest to Gareth that maybe we need to rename the podcast in honor of her and call it the Mary Follett Parker podcast. And he said, I'm not sure any more people will listen to us if we don't know who Mary Parker Follett is.
Yeah.
So you'll be pleased to know we're sticking with battling for business, for now at least. Anyway, back to the next one.
Well, before we do, I was thinking about this during the break, and we were talking about the fact that this is all blindingly obvious now, and I was saying I'm not sure it often is, or it might be obvious, but it's not often put into practice. I was thinking back to a time where I was a middle manager in the Royal Marines, and one of my jobs was to pull together a group of specialists from different parts of defence, so Army, Navy, Air Force and Marines, to support a bit of 3 Commando Brigade if and when we deployed, and we were at what's known as very high readiness, which means we all had our Bergens or rucksacks packed, all our combat gear ready to go, and if and when we were ever activated, the idea was that some of us within 12 hours, some of us within 24 hours, and then the whole of the brigade, as a minimum, within 5 days, could go and be in a country doing operations. And I had to make sure that within this team that we had bits of the Army and the Navy and the Air Force ready to also come and join. And we would routinely talk to these people and go on exercise with them, but they were parts of other organisations. And so I would routinely get told off by the organisation in the Army that managed deployments and exercises, and the organisation in the Navy that managed deployments and exercises, because I was talking directly to these teams. And there were people that were, on a big spreadsheet mandated to support us if and when we were activated for operations, and as an implied task, therefore exercise with us when we practice. And I would say on a weekly basis, get either an email or a phone call, an angry email or an angry phone call, to say, you don't have the authority to talk to these people directly. You need to come through us to ask permission. And I would constantly say, I am not tasking these people. I'm not telling them what to do. I'm simply talking to them so that when I ask you, I know what to ask for, and I already know that they're available and they can do it, to save going through all of the layers of the bureaucracy. And every time you explain that, the person at the other end of the phone would say, okay, I understand that, but you've got to realise that if everybody just talked to each other, we'd lose control. And I'd say, just to remind you, all I'm doing is informally agreeing so that we can formally agree through you. I'm not trying to undermine you. I'm not trying to take away control. Eventually, you build a relationship, you build trust, and everybody would be relatively happy that I could go and talk to other bits of defence, agree in principle, and then formally request through the hierarchy. And then people would get posted and new people would come in and you'd start the process again. And I think this is a classic example of where ideas around cross-functional management, matrix management, ideas around the improved outputs of an organization through empowering people to solve problems, talk to each other, get undermined by the human nature of, if I don't know it's happening, how can I stop bad things happening? If everybody starts talking to each other, surely that will just create chaos. And it's about trust.
Well, I love this because there were two things that occurred to me. The first one was this classic mantra that we've repeated now, certainly recently quite a few times, is these things are simple, but simple things are hard.
Yes.
And so something as a product person, there is beauty in simplicity because it gives you clarity and it gives you focus. But it's really, really difficult to make something simple and easy. It belies it. And so this is a really good case where some very simple concepts, it turns out to do them well are very, very hard for all these reasons. The second idea or thought that came to me was, I wonder what Mary Parker Follett would be doing today. I wonder whether she would say, well, obviously that's the next stage. Okay, you've all come to terms with the fact that I'm not this crazy woke heretic out there. Now let's talk about solving that problem of the need for ownership and control and splitting these things out. So that's fascinating. Anyway, you can't see this obviously if you're listening to this, but I've specifically turned my laptop with my notes away from Gareth so he can't see what I'm going to talk about to keep it fresh and interesting for him. The next of the concepts that she talked about, coordination, which is exactly what you've just said. And she talks about encouraging collaboration between departments or functions like marketing working directly with production to align goals and resolve conflicts. And I couldn't have asked you to come up with a better example of that, Gareth, than your example just now of exactly that. You were coordinating rather than trying to steal authority or create chaos.
Exactly that.
It was coordinating. So the next thing she talks about, decentralized problem solving. And this is going to be an old friend to us, empowering individuals at operational levels to address issues which speed up decisions and make solutions more practical. And we're going, in a second, I'm just going to do one more of these, but I wanted to sort of, I think we've almost over-labored this point, but I want to sort of compare these concepts in the late 1800s, early 1900s with how we talk about them today. But the last one that I'll talk about is coordination is dynamic, not static. I think this is a really sophisticated idea, which is the idea that coordination is seen as an ongoing dynamic process and not something that happens only at set times or through rigid reporting lines. Going back to these points, direct contact, coordination, decentralized problem solving, coordination is dynamic, not static. This is a sophisticated interlocking set of ideas, which is about creating the best outcome, whoever you might be. So I don't want people to go away thinking, oh, wasn't it sweet? She had some of these basic ideas. No, there were lots of these ideas, and we'll talk about more in a second. But actually together, they create this idea of this organic system rather than a mechanistic system to deliver things. And as I was writing these notes about direct contact, coordination, decentralized problem solving, I went away and thought, what are the modern terms that we would use that everyone would nod at? Cross-functional teams, matrix structures, agile practices, collaborative platforms like Slack and email. We wouldn't even blink today. And she was talking about these concepts over 100 years ago. And then I was also thinking about, I actually went back and thought, well, but was the military thinking about this in a different way? And the reality was at this time, I don't think the military were thinking about this in a different way. Even that, I think, evolved a little bit later, although maybe this was around the time. Those ideas of direct contact, coordination, decentralized problem solving, coordination is dynamic, not static. They also, from a military perspective, sound suspiciously like mission command, joint operations and combined arms, continuous command and control, negotiated solutions in coalitions. So
yeah,
she's really frankly, I think it's this astounding reflection of the way the modern world is that even today we find incredibly complex.
So I think It's interesting, the link between this idea of cross-functional coordination and mission command. They're not necessarily the same thing.
They're not.
So
But
mission command is the idea of empowering subordinate organizations, subordinate people to go and achieve a task how they see fit, giving them within their team the freedoms to use their resources effectively in order to achieve a task that meets the greater goal. We've kind of done whole episodes on that. That's slightly different
I think
from allowing subordinate teams to talk to each other.
I think these things are utterly related, though.
They're
I think
absolutely related.
There cannot be one without the other. And
well, I think they can. I think to work effectively, you need to have both. I think you can have empowered teams that aren't allowed to talk to other teams without permission.
You're right, but I think you would argue, though, that the more effective a powered team is the one that has the ability.
Yeah, I wonder if the military by this point, so we're talking sort of turn of the century, and when we were up at the Tedder Academy with the RAF, we were talking about the various different arms of defence and how they come to their ideas around mission command. And I said that the Navy, for example, had learnt mission command by another name by the sheer fact that they sent ships to sea in an age where electronic communication didn't exist. And so they were empowering the captain of the ship by having very, very well understood limits of exploitation. These are the authorities vested in you. Now you've got 2 years at sea, and you'll write letters, and we'll write letters, and you'll pick them up in ports, but while you're at sea, your ship is your domain. And they were forced into that because of the limits of technology, whereas the army didn't have that problem. They had the problem of lots and lots of stuff on a big battlefield and things moving quickly. And so they came to the similar ideas around management and this idea of mission command through a very different set of experiences. The cross-functional nature, I think, sits within the army more naturally because of things like combined arms maneuver. The idea that you have to integrate and coordinate your infantry, your cavalry, your artillery, and, in modern warfare, your electronic warfare, your drones, all of the other enabling capabilities. That happens as a matter of the mission more so than perhaps in the Navy, where a ship functions as a...
But I want to go one step higher, because otherwise I think we get into a slightly reductionist argument about, was the military more mission command focused than whether it's great. Here's the point that I want to make, though. I think what's fascinating is the military was starting to develop these ideas, I think, because they had to.
Yeah.
I think that was their problem, which was, we are living in a world where the people holding the rifles have to do a good job, and there's all sorts of situations. What Mary was saying, though, is I live in a world where people think it's all about the machine, and I'm now saying I'm going to build some ideas that perhaps parallel some of the military ideas, but for a very different reason. I'm not doing it because, in inverted commas, I have to. I'm doing it because actually I recognize there is a more efficient way.
Yeah.
You said something about evolution. I was listening to something recently which said that there are examples of evolution coming up through 3 different routes to the same eye. The eye is the same thing. I wonder whether there's a similar thing, which is these are effective mechanisms for these kinds of situations, even if they evolve through different routes and different reasons.
Well, I was going to sort of get to my final point, which was, RAF aside, if we just take the Navy and the Army, because they've had longer to evolve these processes, and I think there's a whole interesting discussion, but we don't have time for, about how the RAF kind of formed out of both of these. But the Army and the Navy have culturally very, very different management styles, even to this day. And I think as a Royal Marine, I'm kind of in quite an interesting place because I served as part of the Navy. My ID card says Royal Navy. I've served as part of the ship's company on many ships, but I also understand the Army role. I have an Army rank, and I did ground holding with a rifle. That's what the Marines do. And so you get this interesting perspective of both cultures. There's a common phrase in the Army where we talk about we equip the person, whereas in the Navy, we use old-fashioned terminology because we used to talk about equipping the man and manning the equipment. Of course, we're talking about people, but I don't know how you people the equipment. But there's this idea that in the Army, you have tools and you have equipment to support the soldier. In the Navy, you have sailors that crew the ship, and the focus becomes the ship. And there's an understandable reason why. But I think what it means is that these ideas that Mary is talking about, the psychology, the human elements of leading people, become easier to see the effects of in the land army environment than they do in a culture where the focus is on putting sailors to crew the ship and the ship is the focus, not the person.
You may be right, but I think the context for her where it was factories and things like that maybe is more. Maybe it doesn't matter. Isn't it interesting though that we're debating how her ideas are applied?
Yeah.
As opposed to 120 years ago, she came up with these ideas that we've spent 120 hours or 130 hours discussing. There's more. Let's talk about more. I just wanted to, before we go on to some of the other concepts and ideas, I love the idea of understanding what problems people were trying to solve. And she actually talks about what she thinks these ideas support. She wants to reduce inefficiency caused by hierarchical bottlenecks. She wants to improve adaptability and responsiveness in fast-changing environments. She wants to promote shared responsibility across departments, and she wants to prevent siloed thinking. Now, don't get me wrong, she didn't use those exact words. I'm almost using modern words. But I love the idea, going back to my favorite bias, which is none of this was about we should be nice to people. This was all about making this organic system more effective, and here are the things I want to do. So here are some more concepts that she brought forth. The collective power of the team. This is a quote from her, from her work, The Dynamic Administration. The leader is the one who integrates the experience of all members of the group. He finds the thread of unity that runs through their diversities. He draws from each the contribution that each has to make. Interestingly, not only is that the collective power of the team and the role of the leader, but it also talks about diversity, and we'll come back to diversity a little bit later. She talks about informal processes, and she talks about the importance of informal processes, and bearing in mind this is a person from a world where it is all about the process, to your point, standing in the box. But she talks about the authority of expertise, and I love that, because that's this idea of we have formal hierarchies and formal ranks that we give people, but actually within organizations and within teams, there are these informal badges of authority. So in this particular case, this authority of expertise. She talks about effective relationships. She recognizes the importance of community and advances the idea of reciprocal relationships. I mean, obviously, this is wokeness gone mad. She understands the dynamic aspects of the individual in relationship to others. Simply speaking, my performance is related to your performance. Your behavior relates to my behavior and vice versa. Oh, fascinating, these ideas that it almost puts the people at the center of leadership and management rather than the process itself, which I think, again, touch on things that we strongly believe. Next one she talks about, empowerment. Now, she advocates the principle of what she talks about as integration or non-coercive power sharing. And her phrase, and this is one that came up a lot through my research, where I think she's more famous on, is the concept of power with rather than power over. Again, very different
Yeah.
in terms of we are a team together and I have power with some other people rather than I tell you what to do, shut up, I'm the only person who knows. She believed that all people, regardless of their identification or role, acted based on the treatment they received. So she believed that managers, which was this again, we're getting back to the heretical stuff, managers did not need to manipulate subordinates to get the desired behavior, but instead can train them to be empowered thinkers capable of creating desired results of their own accord. Power, quote, power is not a thing, not a static quantity to be divided or shared, but a dynamic situation. My power depends on the power you develop in me.
Yeah. And we did an episode on power, politics, and strategy, and I think we came to similar conclusions that it's not a zero-sum game.
But we're second to this.
And I know,
really bad.
But it's amazing that what I'm struck by is the level of the broadness of her thought, the conclusions that she's coming to in an age where a lot of the now established theories, sort of common understanding of these practices, processes, theories, and concepts didn't exist. And she is, I think you're right to use the word radical, because she's really pushing back on some probably quite embedded thinking in a way that retrospectively we go, well, that's bloody common sense. We all know that now. But it's amazing at the time how broad her concepts are and how radical they are, and yet over time have proven to be
I think
so adept, so right.
You know, I'm reminding everyone this is an influencers episode. I started off by saying you probably won't have heard of her. You'll think that this is all blindingly obvious, but given where she came from and the impact it's had on us to where we are today, do we define her as one of the most influential influencers we've done? Maybe. I don't know. Let's go back to another quote. This is another quote I got from, I think this was the work dynamic situation. If you stood up today at a leadership conference and said this, people wouldn't blink. And she did this over 100 years ago. Leadership is not defined by the exercise of power, but by the capacity to increase the sense of power among those led. Isn't that really, really interesting about empowerment? You'd get a round of applause for that in an audience today and going, oh, that's wise words. Interesting. She talked, I mean, I mentioned this before, leadership is not just a title or a rank, so she goes into a lot of that. This is another one which I thought was fascinating. Perhaps it's more a reflection of the time, but it's a great Trivial Pursuit question. Where does the term win-win come from? Mary Parker Follett, in case you're
right. Okay. Yeah.
She talked about this idea that management doesn't have to be something where someone has to lose.
Yeah.
Where someone has to be, in effect, subjugated to achieve your outcomes. She actually apparently coined the term, coined the term win-win in her work with groups. Quote, there are three ways of dealing with difference: domination, compromise, and integration. And she goes on to say that domination works, but for a very short period of time. Compromise kind of works, but you're not really solving the problem. You're saying, what's the least crappy answer we can come up with? And her point was about integration is really, can we find a way of solving a problem in a way that's novel, that both of us get what we want? And she gives a beautiful example of this, which I think sums it up, which is she's in a library and someone wants to open the window and she doesn't want to open the window because then the wind will blow on her book. So they sit down and discuss this. And are they going to compromise? Well, domination, bad idea. I'm going to open the window, bad. Well, you know, I'll let you open the window and I'll suffer the wind. No. What does she do? They say, well, why don't we open the window over there where we'll still get the breeze, but the breeze won't be on my books? That's her concept of integration. That's her concept of win-win.
Which is, again, amazing. I've cheated. I've had to Google, whilst you were talking, when game theory was formalised as an idea. The 1940s.
Isn't that amazing?
We all know of John Nash and we know of game theory, but this is foundational to game theory. This is the idea that you have situations where there are winners and losers, but you can also have situations where there are winners and winners. And these are the foundational concepts of what ultimately becomes a very complex mathematical theory in game theory. And I'm not trying to simplify it and say that she came up with game theory, but she is coming up with concepts that are yet to be formalized, and yet she is talking about them and thinking about them in a way that we talk about these things today because we know of these foundational concepts. She's such a brilliant thinker to understand these things in a time where this was not common discussion, even within the academic world.
I think the depth of it. Here's two more things. The last two couldn't be more topical. Harnessing conflict to create a positive outcome. So she embraces conflict as a mechanism of diversity and an opportunity to develop what you've heard me describe as integrated solutions rather than just compromising. She didn't think the purpose of conflict was just as a means of turmoil. It was an opportunity to actually strengthen the relationship. So this idea of conflict resolution, which not only do we think about more today, and there are classes on conflict resolution, and there is training on how exactly that conflict can be good if it's done in a positive, thoughtful and controlled way. She was talking about it. And then last but not least, and this is from Creative Experience, which she wrote, I think was written posthumously from her notes in 1924. Unity, not uniformity, must be our aim. We attain unity only through variety. Differences must be integrated, not annihilated, not absorbed. You know, this is my hot button around diversity. How fascinating. There was a person who was very, very clearly saying that she is looking for unity and not uniformity. That, I think, is brilliant.
If somebody had given that as a speech today, I think we'd all give them a round of applause and say, you've absolutely encapsulated the problem and the challenge with the current culture wars. You said something that is very, very difficult to push back on and say, I disagree with that, in a very pithy sentence that in 2025, we would all go, that's insightful.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it?
This is sort of turn of the last.
Well, this was 1924. It was
1924,
published, but it was based on her work.
But based on her work from turn of the century. This is amazingly insightful stuff of an age where actually there are lots of very, very well-regarded academics, managers, leaders across industry, academia, and the military and politics who are all espousing uniformity as the way of getting coherence.
Talked about this a little bit earlier, and I think it's useful to, as human beings, we love the idea that this person did this thing on this date and this is what it changed. The reality of life and knowledge and understanding is that it's a lot messier than that. I was brought up thinking that Charles Darwin created the theory of evolution, and it turns out, well, that's a lie we like to tell ourselves, and it turns out in France
it's an oversimplification.
It's an oversimplification.
Yeah.
But rather than me sort of try and say it's just complicated, actually I think it's this, I'm going to use this word, melange of ideas.
That's a good word.
Well, I might have to edit it out because that does sound a bit tossy, to be honest. But it's this idea that she was moving the ball further down the field. And maybe knowledge is like a football game where the goal is to put the ball in the net. And before the ball goes in the net, it goes forward a bit, it goes back a bit. And it's all of these things working together. So do I think that Mary Parker Follett was the originator of these ideas and, as it were, owns these ideas? Not in the slightest. But do I think these ideas then over time triggered other people to think about these ideas that in turn we come back to today? I think that's absolutely the case. So is she I said earlier on today, is she the single most important influence we've had? Perhaps not. But without her, perhaps we wouldn't have pushed the ball this close to the net as we have today. So she had all of this thinking, and I've captured a lot of it, but I think there's more. And actually what I wonder is, because there was a very small amount of work that was published, this was the new state, group organizations, the solution of popular government. That was a document she did in 1918. Creative experience in 1924, and then dynamic administration, the collected papers of Mary Parker Follett, which were published posthumously in 1942. And she wrote lots of other articles as well. I do wonder, what have we lost?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? You'd think I bet these weren't her only ideas. What else was she thinking about? In terms of legacy, perhaps, she was one of the first women ever invited to address the London School of Economics, where she spoke about management issues. She was recognized and rewarded even then. She was also sought out by the US President Teddy Roosevelt as his personal consultant on managing not-for-profit, non-government and voluntary organizations. Although I do wonder, like, well, well done, little lady. You can do the non-profit stuff. I don't know. And she died in 1933 in Boston, Massachusetts. And honestly, as you can tell, mostly forgotten. Most of her ideas would disappear from American organizational and management circles at the time, but she slowly got followers in Great Britain. And in the last decades, her work has been rediscovered. In the 1960s, her ideas, you'll love this, re-emerged in Japan, where management thinkers would apply her theories to business. So we rave about some of these Japanese management theories. Of course, Mary influenced those as well. So I hope that was interesting for everyone. We've trotted through, and I'm sure I haven't done her justice, but this incredible thinker over 100 years ago. And I'm left with the following thoughts and conclusions. First of all is, how have we forgotten about Mary Parker Follett? Is it just a function of time? Is there a bit of misogyny? There's some other people out there that have these amazing ideas that we should go back and discover. I don't know. The other thing, simple ideas and observations. Remember, I said at the very beginning, a lot of this was derived by her working as a social worker, working in groups with these communal spaces. Simple ideas and observations often belie sophistication and nuance. So the next time you think you see something that's really simple and say, well, that's not very interesting, it's too simple, go look at it. And I wonder what the next generation of ideas are beyond this. So here you go, Gareth. Here's the thought for you. We look back, and as wise time travelers, we say, well, of course, this was post-industrial revolution. It was all about how do you make your engine work more effectively. But Mary saw beyond that. She saw a new, radically different world where the people and how you worked with the people would change the game. And I think it would be all too easy for us to say, and of course, nothing has changed since Mary's time. And so therefore, these ideas are still valid. My question is, if we can shift our ideas so much from that pre-industrial age or the industrial age to this world, could we do it again? Is this going to happen again? And I spent 30 seconds thinking about this. Are we about to have this with something like AI? Now, I apologize. I should drink because I've said the word AI. But whether or not it is AI. But the key thing I'm trying to say is there a way that the world is going to change that radically shifts how we think about these things?
Yeah.
Is the advent of AI going to change how we need to think about management and leadership? I don't know, and I don't even necessarily. But do you know what I mean? I think
there's a very simple answer, which is yes. I think the more difficult question is how.
Yes,
and that's what we're yet to find out. But when we talk about where we currently are, we are at a stage where we're starting to see the emergence of machines doing tasks that humans used to do better, in the same way that during Mary Parker Follett's time, we saw machines starting to do tasks that humans do better. In her time, it was machining, it was fabrication and production of things. In our age, it's the quantification of data, it's the trend analysis, it's the sentiment analysis, it's a whole load of stuff that machine learning large language models and AI is able to do and continues to develop and grow in ways that we are yet to realize and understand. So I think, yes, we will absolutely have to see a different way of thinking about leadership, management, and command. We don't know what the answers are.
No, but
We have to go forward collectively with our minds open to the fact that what seems right today isn't necessarily right for
well, I'll go one step further. Not just what seems right today, but which seems unchangeable today.
Yes.
Because and maybe we do come back and spend an episode and say, okay, well, let's talk about this. Let's think about this. How does leadership and management change in these scenarios? But I think this is why we endlessly do this over our cups of coffee or beers or glasses of wine, which is you need to have people having these conversations and thinking about it to make these breakthroughs.
Yeah.
At the time, I'm sure someone would have patted Mary on the head and said, well, this is all very well. We've already solved these problems.
Yeah.
Or they would have said, it's woke gone mad what you're saying. The reality is you keep talking. And this was maybe my final point, which was what struck me with this as an example was there is great value in looking at ideas throughout history.
Yeah.
And even though the context has changed, I think as you read through these things, you make new connections and you make new, oh, that's like this and this is how they thought about it. And my analogy was it feels like this is like gold panning. And actually, I'm going to be going on holiday in a couple of weeks, and I'm going to read through Mary Follett Parker's document. I can't remember which one I've got, because it feels like it's gold panning where there's a golden nugget in there somewhere.
I hadn't thought about
exactly 90% of this. You say, yeah, that's fine. I get that, and I see that, and that's a bit outdated, and I agree. But then there's that last one. She says, "Sorry, what did you say?"
Yeah.
Oh my God! And even to our point about AI, what you have just said there is incredibly prescient because now I can make a connection to this new world.
Well, it's you asking that question has made me realise that my definitions of management, command, and leadership that I am, wedded to because they're what I've developed over the last 20 years, need updating because my definition of command, I think, still stands. This idea of it is the balance of accountability, authority, and responsibility across the organisation. I think that stands. Management is the management of resources across the organisation, be it people's time, money, stock, inventory, infrastructure, stationery. Doesn't matter. It's the management and balance. It's a bureaucratic and often statistical process of doing the day-to-day allocation of resource. Leadership, the getting people to do things who don't perhaps want to do them, motivating people, leading by example, sometimes punishing people or threatening punishment, sometimes encouraging through incentives. There's a whole load of different aspects to it, but it's getting people to do things. Well, in a world where I can't tell the difference between a person and a machine at the other end of my laptop, sometimes I don't know if I'm talking to a person or not. And we've seen more and more examples of that, effectively machines throwing the Turing test out of the water. And in a world where I am having to work daily with large language models to develop my relationship with them, and I use the word relationship in inverted commas, but ultimately the way I interact with my language model today will affect the answers it gives me tomorrow. So I am building over time a relationship with it because it's learning about me. Means that suddenly I'm now talking about how I get people and machines to do things. And I think your question has made me question my my definitions. And I think we are going to start to see this blurring of the lines again between the concept of leadership and management, because machines are part of the thing that we're going to have to build relationships with. And we could call them artificial relationships, or we could say that they're not as deep, or we can have
You're back to the getting people and machines to do things for you in the most effective way.
Yeah.
We've had a trot, and I hope Mary would be proud of us that at the end of our sort of a quick trot through her life, we can connect her ideas with what possibly maybe is the next generation of ideas or questions we don't even know we have to ask yet. I hope you enjoyed that, Gareth.
Right.
Well, I love the fact that we've done over 120, 130 episodes. What Mary has done is gently tap us on the shoulder and says there's probably another 100 episodes. There's probably more stuff you discuss, because none of this stands still.
No.
It all evolves. And even if you think you've got your finger on something, it turns out there's probably an evolution of that idea, or there's the next version of that idea, or there's a misunderstanding. So lots to do there. Thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed that. If you like that, please go to wherever you get your podcast. And if you haven't already, please do hit the subscribe button. Please also leave a review. We really want other people to hear us rambling on, because frankly, we're fed up of our own voices. So if you can leave a review, that definitely helps the algorithms. And if you've only heard this one, or you've heard a couple, please do go back and look at the many, many, many episodes we've got before. And it was interesting as we were talking about Mary's varied ideas that connect. I can't think of a better way of describing our podcast, which is there's all these different concepts and ideas, but actually they all come together in this topic of leadership and management. So please do go have a listen. I think we do have to be careful not to keep saying every third phrase we've done an episode on that, but we probably have done an episode on that. So please do listen. If you've got an influencer that we have not heard of, or you think we should talk about or investigate, please email us on battlingwithbusiness@gmail.com. We really do appreciate your feedback. Even if it's to shout at us and tell us we're terrible, or that you liked it, please let us know. We also try to post regularly on Battling with Biz with a Z on Blue Sky and Twitter, and certainly all our new episodes go there. And we also post on our LinkedIn pages as well, if you happen to see that. I think that's probably it for now, though, Gareth. Thank you for joining us on this week's episode. Thank you, Mary Parker Follett, for surprising us after all these years and delighting us with people attaching concepts and ideas from over 100 years ago, entirely relevant to what we do today. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next week on Battling with Business.